Okay, let's get into this. You know how sometimes learning new words, maybe for a language like English, feels like just memorizing a
Oh,
list?
absolutely. It can feel really dry, like a chore.
Yeah, just staring at definitions. What if it felt more like you were playing, like stepping into a story?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? How to make that shift from just passive learning to something active.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about today. We're looking at a really interesting study, one that explored if using role play could actually make a difference for junior high students learning English vocabulary.
Right. The paper we're digging into is called The Use of Role Play Method to Improve Students' Vocabulary at Junior High School. It was published back in June 2020 in a journal from Unisma Makassar.
Okay, so our mission here is basically to unpack this study. What did they find out? Does role play, actually help students get better with English words, specifically nouns and verbs? What are the key things you need to know?
Well, first, I think we need to understand why vocabulary is such a big deal in the first place, which the paper really highlights.
Yeah, the source makes it sound like it's not just a part of learning English, it's kind of the foundation.
That's exactly how it's presented. It's fundamental. The paper calls vocabulary the key to unlocking listening, writing, speaking, and reading, all four skills.
Wow, okay. So you need the words before you can really do anything else.
Pretty much. It's the basic stuff you need to communicate to get your ideas across. And the study also points out that having good vocabulary mastery is linked to doing better overall in English classes.
Okay, so it's crucial, foundational.
Yeah.
But how does this paper actually define vocabulary?
It talks about it as basically all the words someone knows and uses in a language, like your personal word list with meaning.
Just words you actually have in your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it mentions this distinction between passive vocabulary, words you recognize when you read or hear them.
Like words you know of.
Right. And active vocabulary, the words you actually pull out and use yourself when you speak or write. And mastery means knowing the word's pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, both the direct dictionary definition, the denotation, and also the feelings or ideas connected to it, the connotation.
Got it. So knowing it inside out. And the study didn't try to teach all vocabulary, right? It focused.
Yes, exactly. It zoomed right in on nouns and verbs.
The real basics.
Absolutely. You can't build sentences without them.
So how did they try to improve those? This is where the role play comes in, right?
Yeah.
What exactly is the role play method according to this paper?
So the paper describes it as a way to learn by um, getting students to use their imagination. They play characters, act out scenes from a story or some kind of social situation.
So less flashcards, more acting.
That's the core idea, yeah.
Mm.
And it naturally gets them practicing speaking. The source even mentions some experts who see it as really important for, practicing communication in different settings and roles.
Putting the language into action.
Yes. And the paper argues it helps develop fluency, gets students interacting with each other, and, maybe crucially, it boosts motivation.
Ah, motivation. That sounds like a big plus, especially for junior high. Were there other benefits mentioned?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. It lets students use a wider variety of language than maybe they would in standard drills.
Okay.
It can also touch on cultural things, like how do you act politely if someone offers you food in English, that kind of practical stuff.
That's useful.
For sure. And it makes things more interesting. It gets everyone involved because they have a role. And you can repeat language practice just by changing the scenario slightly. It helps them, communicate more effectively overall.
Sounds really promising in theory. So how did they actually test this? What did the study do?
It was what they call pre-experimental.
Yeah.
Basically, a one group before and after test. See what happens when you introduce role play.
Just measure the change in one group.
Exactly. The goal was clear.
Mm.
See if role play caused vocabulary improvement.
And this was in Indonesia, you said?
Yep, at a school called SMP Handiani Sungguh Manasa.
And the students.
Well, the school had 90 eighth graders total, but they used purposive sampling.
Meaning they picked a specific group.
Right. They chose one class, ABC,
Wow.
with 30 students. And they chose that class because the teacher had pointed out that their English vocabulary scores were, well, pretty low.
So they targeted a group that could really use the help.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, so how did they measure the impact?
Pretty straightforward design. First, a pre-test. Measured their noun and verb knowledge at the start.
The baseline.
Then, the treatment they used role play activities to teach and practice vocabulary for a period.
The intervention.
Exactly. And finally, a post-test. Same kind of test. See where the students landed after the role play experience.
Pre-test, role play, post-test. Simple enough. Okay, let's get to the juicy part. What were the results? Did the role play actually work?
This is where it gets really compelling. The numbers showed a pretty dramatic improvement. So before the role play, on the pretest, the average score for nouns was about 49, and for verbs, just over 50. The paper actually calls this starting level inadequate.
Okay, so starting low, like they expected. What about after the post-test?
Huge difference. After the role play, the average noun score jumped to over 72, and the verb score went up to nearly 75.
Wait, hold on. A jump of like 20 points, 25 points on average. That's massive.
It really is. If you look at percentages, noun scores improved by almost 47%, and verb scores by over 48%.
Wow, nearly a 50% increase in the average score just from using role play? That seems huge. Did it lift everyone equally, or did it change the overall picture?
That's maybe even more striking. The paper has these tables, right, showing how students were classified based on their scores. Before, a lot of students were in the poor or very poor brackets. For nouns, something like 56% were rated poor.
Okay, so more than half were struggling significantly, and after the role play,
Totally different picture. After the intervention, 0% were classified as poor for nouns, none.
zero. Seriously, the whole distribution just shifted upwards. Now, for nouns, about 56% were in the fairly good range post-test, compared to only maybe 6 or 7% before. And you started seeing students pop up in the good and very good categories, which were empty before.
Wow, so it wasn't just the average moving up, it fundamentally changed how many students were actually succeeding versus struggling.
Yeah,
But could this have just been luck? Was it statistically significant?
they ran the numbers, yeah, t-tests, and the results were very clear. The statistical values they got were way, way higher than the threshold you'd expect by chance.
So highly unlikely this was just some random fluke. The data strongly points towards the role play actually causing this improvement.
Exactly. Statistically speaking, the link is strong.
Okay, undeniable results then. Scores shot up, classifications changed dramatically. So digging into the paper's discussion, why did they think role play worked so well here, especially for nouns and verbs? Well, the discussion links it directly back to the method itself. Using role play, focusing on nouns and verbs within those acted-out scenarios, seemed to help students not just learn the words, but also get better at telling them apart, using them correctly in context.
So it wasn't just memorizing definitions, it was about using them in a situation, active learning.
Precisely. And this seems important. The paper mentions what the students thought. They apparently found it helpful. They said it made learning vocabulary more interesting and easier to remember.
Ah, that engagement piece again, if the kids are into it.
It makes a huge difference. The study really suggests that getting the students actively involved was a key reason it worked so well. The interactive nature of role play seemed tailor-made for getting these nouns and verbs to stick.
Right. Active participation plus positive student feedback seems like a winning combo. So, let's wrap this part up. What was the study's final main conclusion?
The bottom line, according to the paper, is pretty clear. Using the role play method was effective. It worked to improve these junior high students' vocabulary, specifically their noun and verb knowledge.
And the proof is in the pudding? The students just did much better on the vocabulary tests after the role play compared to before?
Correct. The data showed a clear positive impact from the intervention.
Okay, so the big takeaway for you listening is this. This research really suggests that for students around that junior high age, using an active, engaging method like role play can make a really significant, measurable difference in building that core English vocabulary, especially those essential nouns and verbs.
Yeah, it's a great example of how moving beyond just, textbook exercises and integrating something dynamic can really change the learning outcome, make it more effective, maybe even more fun.
Absolutely. So whether you're struggling with vocabulary yourself, or maybe you're a teacher looking for new ways to engage students, or honestly, even if you're just curious about learning, this study shows the power of bringing words to life through action.
It really emphasizes that context, and actually using the words are incredibly powerful for making them stick.
Which leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? If making learning feel like play, like acting things out, can boost something like vocabulary so much, what other subjects, what other skills that we usually teach more passively could be totally transformed or supercharged just by making them more interactive, by getting people involved, imagining, and actually doing? Something to mull over.